Always trust.
We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world?
Usred rata u Gazi, postojeći rascjep u UN-u i međunarodnoj zajednici je ponovno izašao na vidjelo. Bila su potrebna 3 tjedna da UN izađe s rezolucijom o ratu. Kao protest protiv neuspjeha UN-a da osudi, kako je on nazvao, pokolj palestinskog naroda od strane Izraela, 31.10. Mokhiber dao je ostavku. U pismu u kojem daje otkaz navodi da ponovno svjedočimo genocidu pred našim očima, a organizacija kojoj služimo čini se nemoćna da ga zaustavi. U napadu na Gazu dosad je ubijeno više od 11.000 Palestinaca, od čega najmanje 4.500 djece. Svakih 10 minuta u Gazi je ubijeno jedno dijete. Dosad je u izraelskim napadima ubijen najmanje 41 novinar, 190 medicinskih radnika i više od 100 zaposlenika UN-a. Bez jasnih naznaka o okončanju napada Izraela na Gazu razgovaram sa donedavnim šefom njujorškog ureda visokog povjerenika UN-a za ljudska prava. Mr. Mokhiber, hello and welcome to Al Jazeera.
Hello, nice to be here.
So in the intro, I mentioned some of the reasons for your resignation, but I will use this chance to ask you directly, why did you resign?
Well, I started this conversation actually in March after a series of Israeli human rights violations on the West Bank, including some Israeli military attacks and in particular the settler pogrom against Palestinians in the village of Hawara. And at that time, I indicated that I had seen a trend over time of a bit of a trepidatious approach on the part of the UN, especially the political corridors of the UN, that seemed to be afraid to call out the serious violations that were taking place when they were committed by Israel in particular, and in general by powerful Western states. The organization has never had any difficulty in calling out abuses by armed groups or by smaller states. But when it comes to powerful Western states and their allies, I had noticed a trend of silence. And so at that moment, I indicated my concerns about this, my call for a stronger and more principled approach to what was happening, and indicated that I, after 32 years, would be leaving the organization. And of course, since March, the situation on the ground only got much worse. And so I sat down and penned a very detailed letter in the wake of the beginning of the genocide in the Gaza Strip, saying why I believed under international law it was a case of genocide, where the UN had lost its way, and where I hoped it would turn its attention in the future.
You said in one interview you felt there was a disconnect between UN's normative obligations and the UN's political approach to Palestine-Israel question. And you just mentioned also the failure of the UN. Where is the UN failing?
I think the UN is failing, especially when it comes to speaking truth to power. And here I want to say my critique is not of the idea of the UN or of the entire UN. There are a lot of UN people who are absolutely heroic, including more than 100 of whom have been killed under Israeli bombs just in the last month, but also so many humanitarian workers and human rights workers and development workers who are working for the UN because they believe in the cause of human rights and peace and development. But my view is that they have been increasingly abandoned by the political leadership of the UN, intergovernmental bodies like the Security Council, but also the political leaders inside the UN itself, who have tended increasingly to defer to state power rather than being true to the norms and standards of the organization that demand human rights, accountability for perpetrators, whoever they are, redress for victims, whoever they are. And we saw this most acutely demonstrated in the situation of the Middle East.
Mr. Mokhiber, this year is the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The same year was the creation of Israel, as well as the start of Nakba, when hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were ethnically cleansed by Israel. How intertwined are the histories of the United Nations and of Palestine?
Well, deeply intertwined. 1948, as you mentioned, was the year that the Universal Declaration was adopted. It was the year of the Nakba, the first genocide of the Palestinian people in Palestine. It was also the year that apartheid was adopted in South Africa. And if you look at the way the organization has dealt with Palestine versus the way it dealt in South Africa, the UN and the international community remained steadfast in defending human rights, humanitarian law, the principle of equality until apartheid fell in South Africa. In Palestine, it was a different story. That paradigm of law and rights and equality was effectively abandoned about 30 years ago when the Oslo process started, and with it, abandonment of the Palestinian people, who have seen since then just increasing persecution, dispossession, gross violations of their human rights, and ultimately now even genocide. The UN has been implicated for a long time. Now, there are parts of the UN, like the independent human rights mechanisms and parts of the Human Rights Office, who have remained steadfast in defending Palestinian human rights. But again, the political leadership of the organization, and I believe largely in fear of Western states like the United States, the UK, the European Union, have abandoned that cause with regard to Palestine. And you can see it even now with senior UN personnel just repeating the old mantras of a solution, when they know, and everyone who's involved knows, that the two-state solution is no longer even a possibility. There's nothing left for a Palestinian state. The two-state solution never paid attention to the human rights of the Palestinian people, who would be relegated to second-class citizenship inside Israel. And my point was, the UN needs to call in the Middle East what it calls for in every other situation, which is equality. In this case, equality for Christians, Jews, democratic, secular governance, a right to return in compensation for those who have been purged from the land, accountability for perpetrators, redress for victims. The formula that we demand in every other conflict situation needs to be applied to Palestine as well.
You have said, and I quote, that what we are witnessing in Gaza is a textbook example of genocide, and you have already mentioned it in the interview now as well. Could you elaborate on your use of term genocide and the phases of genocide with special focus on the intent?
Yeah, you're right to emphasize intent. Genocide is a term that's very much politically abused. People claim genocide where it is not the crime that's occurring, although there are other crimes, and they deny it where it is occurring. This is a very unique case, because here, under the UN Genocide Convention, which has a specific definition and specific elements, if you look at what's been happening in Gaza and more broadly in Palestine, you will see that this is a very clear case where the acts that are prohibited in the Genocide Convention are being committed with great clarity. So, for example, we have mass killing, we have serious harm, including bodily harm on a wide scale. We have the imposition, and this is from the convention itself, the imposition of conditions of life that are designed to bring out the destruction of the group. Well, we know about the siege and closure of the Gaza Strip for many years now, specifically designed to make conditions unlivable there. And so a whole series of the acts, but most importantly, as you point out, we have a situation here which is unprecedented, where the genocidal intent of the perpetrators is very clearly stated publicly and on the record and repeatedly. In most cases of genocide, you have to do a lot of research, get into government archives, find the dusty documents to determine what the intentions were. Here, you've got the president, the prime minister, senior military officials on the record expressing their genocidal intent, dehumanizing Palestinians, talking about not distinguishing between combatants and civilians in Gaza, talking about wiping out all of Gaza, the prime minister invoked a biblical verse that talks about killing everybody, men, women, children, suckling babies, and livestock, and sparing none, in a public statement, in a public speech. So this is a very rare case where all of the acts enumerated in the Genocide Convention are being perpetrated on a wide scale, while the genocidal intent is being communicated very directly as well. And worryingly, in past genocides, we've seen powerful Western states do nothing to stop the genocide. But in this case, it's even worse. We've seen active complicity on the part of powerful Western states in an active genocide in Gaza. Countries of the West, like the United States, that are arming, providing economic support, providing diplomatic support, providing intelligence support, even using the veto in the UN to prevent a stop to the genocide. That is legally complicity, not just doing nothing, but actually participating.
So if it's legally complicity, at one point when and however this war may end, do you think that either Israel or those you claim are complicit could or would be prosecuted for all of that?
Well, this is the central point in my letter, was my frustration with impunity and with the failure to hold powerful states to account in the way the international community is ready to hold weaker states and armed groups and others to account. What has happened so far is that we have seen that accountability for Israel and its Western partners has been essentially non-existent. The UN human rights mechanisms have carried out a series of investigations, on the record, commissions of inquiry, independent special investigators. All of the evidence has been presented in previous atrocities, and I fully expect in this case as well, we'll see an investigation that puts the evidence on the record, even that lists the perpetrators, so that they can be held accountable in a court of law. And because these are crimes of universal jurisdiction, perpetrators can be held accountable in any court, even in a third state, if somebody were indictment. But what has happened at the international level is mechanisms like the International Criminal Court have shown a terrible double standard. They moved with great rapidity to hold Russians accountable with regard to the events in Ukraine, and they've been dragging their feet for years to act on claims brought with regard to Israeli violations because of pressure from the West. Now, I think something is changing. It's going to be hard for the International Criminal Court to ignore genocide unfolding in its own time. And I think we will see actions in third-party courts brought as well to hold Israelis and others accountable. But you can bet that powerful states will resist this every step of the way, as they always have in the past. And that's what the public needs to work for us, to demand accountability, because it is the impunity of the perpetrators that has led to so many successive attacks on Palestinian human rights year after year, decade after decade.
Well, speaking of impunity of Israel, and also speaking of the UN, there have been dozens of UN resolutions condemning and having a stance on Israeli attitude and actions towards Palestinians in the past decades. However, most of them were non-binding. But perhaps my question to you, and now regarding the United Nations as a body as well, is you know, what we witnessed just recently is the veto power and the handicapping effect it has on some kind of unity existing within the United Nations regarding the ceasefire. So what can you tell me about this handicap, and is it time to make some changes to the United Nations?
I think it's long overdue to have some serious reform to the United Nations. The question is how. Those who were empowered after the Second World War with the veto in the Security Council, basically the 5 victors of the Second World War, have shown no real political willingness to give up their monopoly on power within the UN Security Council, and that is a real problem. I think there are other ways to go around the Security Council. We have seen member states move for emergency special sessions of the General Assembly, who have adopted resolutions that have been overwhelmingly supported by countries all around the world. But of course, as you say, there is no opportunity for enforcement outside of the Security Council. However, one other avenue of enforcement is courts of law. So where the Security Council is falling down, where the General Assembly cannot enforce, there needs to be a push to hold individuals accountable in a court of law. And one can also imagine, and I expect this may happen as well, a case before the World Court, the International Court of Justice, between states to hold Israel accountable for genocide in this case, in addition to individual criminal responsibility for perpetrators. I think there will be a very strong move in the coming weeks and months to hold individuals accountable outside of the political mechanisms of the UN. And I fully expect that there will be an investigation mandated by the Human Rights Council at some point that will collect evidence and names, and that can then feed into these judicial processes wherever they happen to take place, either in the International Criminal Court or in national courts. But again, accountability is absolutely essential to preventing this from happening again and again.
Just for the sake of understanding all of this, and because this case of seeming impunity is not the first and only one when Israel is in question, and because we've witnessed it in the past, where do you think that impunity of Israel stems from? And if I can add a question, do you think, and I think you kind of spoke about it a little bit, are things changing? Because those who would usually seem, either some of the world media or governments to, who would seem to close an eye to atrocities happening in Gaza, are, because of the unprecedented scale of crimes, now having to report on it and having to speak about it. So do you think that this moment might be a breakthrough?
I think it is. I think we're seeing cracks emerge all over the place. I mean, the impunity is derived principally from the support of powerful Western states like the United States, the UK, the European Union, and I must say by Western corporate media outlets that are very much committed to Israeli impunity as well. But we are seeing cracks that are coming not from within those institutions, but from within the populations of those Western states, just as we've seen people standing up all around the world. And that demand that's coming from the streets, from the people in these countries, is so powerful that they are even challenging legal prohibitions on demonstrating and marching in the streets at risk of arrest and being beaten by police and so on, because they refuse to accept what their governments are participating in the genocide in Gaza. That's very hopeful. We see Jewish and Christian and Muslim and others, human rights defenders, peace activists, all standing side by side and marching in capitals around the world, demanding that this end, that there be a ceasefire, that there be an end to apartheid in Israel and Palestine, that there be an end to the persecution of the Palestinian people, and that a new system be established with equal rights for everybody. I don't think that Western governments or any governments can withstand the pressure from below. Those politicians who have been complicit in this genocide of 2023, they will suffer the judgment of history for their complicity. But I think some of them will also pay a political price in terms of electability, and some of them will be held accountable in a court of law if this current groundswell of demand for accountability and human rights continues to gather steam. And I think it will. I think the situation is changing, that the wall of impunity is beginning to crack, and I think it's the duty of every decent person to work to make sure that we expedite that shift and move toward a response to what's happening in the Middle East based upon what we demand everywhere else, which is human rights, equality, and the rule of law.
How do you then comment on the discrepancy between the world response and meaning also UN response to the Russia's invasion of Ukraine compared to Israel's attack on Gaza?
Well, I think it is a very clear example of a terrible double standard that exists, and of the complicity of Western states in perpetuating that double standard. It is just a fact that in Western states, where the victims are white and European and Christian, the response is very different than when the victim are people of the East or the South, because of the deeply embedded racism in the foreign policy of countries across the globe, and especially, I have to say, in the West. You only have to compare the response to refugee flows, the critique of the war crimes, the calls for accountability, the quick way that the International Criminal Court moved with regard to Ukraine, and it's dragging its feet for many, many years with regard to Palestine, to see this horrific double standard. I think because of the scope of this horrific onslaught against Palestinian civilians in Gaza, that too is being shaken. And those institutions that have been so ready to hold up this double standard are being shamed now into having to try to close the gap at least a little bit. And I think the pressure is going to stay on. I think we will see a change in the International Criminal Court. And I hope we will see a change in some Western and European governments for an approach which is much more based on human rights and less based upon a very biased, I have to say, sometimes overtly racist foreign policy.
We've spoken about the veto power. We've spoken about problems within the infrastructure and the way the United Nations works. Ever since the start of this war, we've had different voices from around the world speak about the UN as weak or dead or incapable. I would like to ask you, even though you left the organization, how dangerous, and are these claims dangerous, and the image of United Nations becoming that, how dangerous is that for world peace and for order within the global politics?
It's very dangerous. I mean, we have to remember that the UN was established after the Second World War to provide a forum that can present an alternative to the old system of deciding global questions based upon armed conflict, of insisting upon human rights, insisting on economic and social development. That framework is more important now than it has ever been, but it is challenged. Its reputation is being challenged by its failures. And I think, a fair assessment will always be specific when asking which UN we're criticizing. Criticism of the Security Council is absolutely essential. The political leadership, I think that has to come as well to put pressure for a more principled approach. At the same time, we should celebrate those parts of the UN that are doing very important work upon which millions rely, the human rights workers, the humanitarian workers, the development workers, and others, peacekeepers, who really are making a contribution to a better world. But as I've said, they have been abandoned by the political leadership. Make sure that there's enough pressure for reform that those challenges can be overcome. If the UN loses all credibility, as it has in some quarters, and we're left in a situation like we were before the Second World War, without this platform for the peaceful resolution of disputes and enforcement of human rights, this world is going to head into a very dangerous spiral. So we shouldn't abandon the UN. We should work hard, pressure on the UN to correct its faults and to make sure that it applies those principles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 75 years old today, to everybody equally, not based upon political fear or favor.
Mr. Mokhiber, it's been evident and reported on for decades that the proposed peace solutions for Israel and Palestine are not promoting or ensuring equality between Israel and Palestine. Could you tell us a little bit about the discrepancy and the asymmetry of this conflict, which often seems to be pushed aside?
Well, that's right. As I say, up until about 30 years ago, the approach was based on human rights and international law. That approach was abandoned when the Oslo process was born. And in its place, we got this amorphous political formulation that basically said, we have to defer to the parties. Well, when you defer to the parties, which are occupier and occupied, oppressor and oppressed, you're basically just deferring to the powerful party. So in this case, you're deferring to Israel. And we've seen what the result of that has been. With this smokescreen of the two-state solution that, frankly, no one involved believes is a possibility anymore because there's nothing left for a Palestinian state. Just repeating that phrase is a way of avoiding talking about the real root causes and situation on the ground. The problem of settler colonialism, the problem of occupation, the problem of apartheid. If you don't remedy those things, you will never have peace and you will never have human rights. But this just rote recitation by politicians of the two-state solution has provided an opportunity for continued dispossession, persecution, occupation, and settlement activity in apartheid until we reach the point where we are now, which is an open genocide against the Palestinian people. We have to once and for all say that this failed political paradigm needs to go away and it needs to be replaced with the principles of the UN, which are equality, which are human rights for everybody. And until we move in that direction, politicians walking around and just repeating the same old tired phases are only contributing to continued suffering in the Middle East.
Mr. Mokhiber, for the end, there's a lot of talk right now. There's a lot of discussion happening around the globe about Palestine and Israel. But what I think, I guess it's time to speak about the solution and what comes after this war ends. So based on the fact that we just discussed that the previous solutions were not viable and were not good for Palestinians primarily, which path do you think should be taken?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that there is only one path that is based upon human rights, equality, and the rule of law. And that is to work for an end to apartheid, an end to occupation, an end to settlement, accountability for genocide and other gross violations of human rights, and then the building of a single democratic secular state with equal rights for Christians, Muslims, and Jews, a guarantee of the right of return for all of those people who have been purged from their homeland, an honest truth and justice process to reveal what the abuses have been and to provide redress, mobilization of protection for civilians across the land, and basically a response based upon international law and human rights for everybody. So that means abandoning the old approach and moving in the direction of human rights and equality for everybody. The siege of Gaza has to end. Settlement has to end, and we need to work for human rights for everyone in the land.
Mr. Mokhiber, thank you very much for all your time.
Thank you for having me.